Guy Faux by Charles Lamb, 1811 and 1823. A very ingenious and subtle writer, whom there is good reason for suspecting to be an ex-Jesuit, not unknown at Douai some 25 years since, he will not obtrude himself at M.Th. again in a hurry, about a 12-month back, set himself to prove the character of the powder plot conspirators to have been that of heroic self-devotedness and true Christian martyrdom. Under the mask of Protestant candor, he actually gained admission for his treatise into a London weekly paper, not particularly distinguished for its zeal towards either religion. But admitting Catholic principles, his arguments are shrewd and incontrovertible. He says, Guy Faux was a fanatic, but he was no hypocrite. He ranks among good haters. He was cruel, bloody-minded, reckless of all considerations but those of an infuriated and bigoted faith, but he was a true son of the Catholic Church, a martyr and a confessor for all that. He who can prevail upon himself to devote his life for a cause, however we may condemn his opinions or abhor his actions, vouches at least for the honesty of his principles and the disinterestedness of his motives. He may be guilty of the worst practices, but he is capable of the greatest. He is no longer a slave, but free. The contempt of death is the beginning of virtue. The hero of the gunpowder plot was, if you will, a fool, a madman, an assassin. Call him what names you please. Still he was neither knave nor coward. He did not propose to blow up the Parliament and come off scot-free himself. He showed that he valued his own life no more than theirs in such a cause, where the integrity of the Catholic faith and the salvation of perhaps millions of souls was at stake. He did not call it a murder, but a sacrifice which he was about to achieve. He was armed with the Holy Spirit and with fire. He was the Church's chosen servant and her blessed martyr. He comforted himself as the best of cutthroats. How many wretches are there who would have undertaken to do what he intended for a sum of money, if they could have got off with impunity? How few are there who would have put themselves in Guy Faux' situation to save the universe? Yet in the latter case, we affect to be thrown into greater consternation than at the most unredeemed acts of villainy, as if the absolute disinterestedness of the motive doubled the horror of the deed. The cowardice and selfishness of mankind are in fact shocked at the consequences to themselves, if such examples are held up for imitation, and they make a fearful outcry against the violation of every principle of morality, lest they too should be called on for any such tremendous sacrifices, lest they, in their turn, should have to go on the forlorn hope of extra-official duty. Charity begins at home is a maxim that prevails pg 279 as well in the courts of conscience as in those of prudence. We would be thought to shudder at the consequences of crime to others, while we tremble for them to ourselves. We talk of the dark and cowardly assassin. And this is well when an individual shrinks from the face of an enemy and purchases his own safety by striking a blow in the dark. But how the charge of cowardly can be applied to the public assassin, who, in the very act of destroying another, lays down his life as the pledge and forfeit of his sincerity and boldness, I am at a loss to devise. There may be barbarous prejudice, rooted hatred, unprincipled treachery, in such an act, but he who resolves to take all the danger and odium upon himself can no more be branded with cowardice than Regulus devoting himself for his country or Codrus leaping into the fiery gulf. A wily father inquisitor, coolly and with plenary authority condemning hundreds of helpless, unoffending victims to the flames or to the horrors of a living tomb, while he himself would not suffer a hair of his head to be hurt, is to me a character without any qualifying trait in it. Again, the Spanish conqueror and hero, the favorite of his monarch, who enticed 30,000 poor Mexicans into a large open building, under promise of strict faith and cordial goodwill, and then set fire to it, making sport of the cries and agonies of these deluded creatures, is an instance of uniting the most hardened cruelty with the most heartless selfishness. His plea was keeping no faith with heretics. This was Guy Faux too, but I am sure at least that the latter kept faith with himself. He was in earnest in his professions. His was not gay, wanton, unfeeling depravity. He did not murder in sport. It was serious work that he had taken in hand. To see this arch-bigot, this heart-whole traitor, this pale miner in the infernal regions, skulking in his retreat with his cloak and dark lanthorn, moving cautiously about among his barrels of gunpowder loaded with death, but not yet ripe for destruction, regardless of the lives of others, and more than indifferent to his own, presents a picture of the strange infatuation of the human understanding, but not of the depravity of the human will, without an equal. There were thousands of pious papists privy to and ready to applaud the deed when done, there was no one but our old 5th of November friend, who still flutters in rags and straw on the occasion, that had the courage to attempt it. In him, stern duty and unshaken faith prevailed over natural frailty. It is impossible, upon Catholic principles, not to admit the force of this reasoning. We can only not help smiling, with the writer, at the simplicity of the gulled editor, swallowing the dregs of Loyola for the very quintessence of sublimated reason in England at the commencement of the 19th century. We will just, as a contrast, show what we Protestants, who are a party concerned, thought upon the same subject, at a period rather nearer to the heroic project in question. The gunpowder treason was the subject which called forth the earliest specimen, which is left us of the pulpit eloquence of Jeremy Taylor. When he preached the sermon pg 280 on that anniversary, which is printed at the end of the folio edition of his sermons, he was a young man just commencing his ministry, under the auspices of Archbishop Laud. From the learning and maturest oratory which it manifests, one should rather have conjectured it to have proceeded from the same person after he was ripened by time into a bishop and father of the Church. And really, these Romano-Barbari could never pretend to any precedent for an act so barbarous as theirs. A Dramlech indeed killed a king, but he spared the people. Hammon would have killed the people but spared the king. But that both king and people, princes and judges, branch and rush and root, should die at once, as if Caligula's wish were actuated, and all England upon one head, was never known till now, that all the malice of the world met in this as in a centre. The Sicilian evensong, the Matins of St. Bartholomew, known for the pitiless and damned massacres, were but Greek. Capnuscia's Anar, the dream of the shadow of smoke, if compared with this great fire. In tam occupato sculo fabulas vulgars nequitia non invenit. This was a busy age. Herostratus must have invented a more sublimed malice than the burning of one temple, or not have been so much as spoke of since the discovery of the powder treason. But I must make more haste, I shall not else climb the sublimity of this impiety. Nero was sometimes the populare odium, was popularly hated, and deserved it too, for he slew his master and his wife and all his family once or twice over, opened his mother's womb, fired the city, laughed at it, slandered the Christians for it. But yet all these were but principia malorum, the very first rudiments of evil. Add then to these, Herod's masterpiece at Ramah, as it was deciphered by the tears and sad threens of the matrons in an universal mourning for the loss of their pretty infants. Yet this of Herod will prove but an infant wickedness, and that of Nero the evil but of one city. I would willingly have found out an example, but see I cannot. Should I put into the scale the extract of all the old tyrants famous in antique stories? Should I take for true story the highest cruelty, as it was fancied by the most hieroglyphical Egyptian, this alone would pg 281 weigh them down, as if the Alps were put in a scale against the dust of a balance. For had this accursed treason prospered, we should have had the whole kingdom mourn for the inestimable loss of its chiefest glory, its life, its present joy, and all its very hopes for the future. For such was their destined malice, that they would not only have inflicted so cruel a blow, but have made it incurable by cutting off our supplies of joy, the whole succession of the line royal. Not only the vine itself, but all the gemel and the tender olive branches should either have been bent to their intentions, and made to grow crooked, or else been broken. And now, after such a sublimity of malice, I will not instance in the sacrilegious ruin of the neighboring temples, which needs must have perished in the flame, nor in the disturbing the ashes of our entombed kings, devouring their dead ruins like sepulchral dogs. These are but minutes, in respect of the ruin prepared for the living temples. In such strains of eloquent indignation, did Jeremy Taylor's young oratory inveigh against that stupendous attempt, which he truly says had no parallel in ancient or modern times. A century and a half of European crimes has elapsed since he made the assertion, and his position remains in its strength. He wrote near the time in which the nefarious project had like to have been completed. Men's minds still were shuddering from the recentness of the escape. It must have been within his memory, or have been sounded in his ears so young by his parents, that he would seem in his maturer years to have remembered it. No wonder then that he describes it in words that burn. But to us, to whom the tradition has come slowly down and has had time to cool, the story of Guido Fawkes sounds rather like a tale, a fable, and an invention than true history. It supposes such gigantic audacity of daring, combined with such more than infantile stupidity in the motive, such a combination of the fiend and the monkey, That credulity is almost swallowed up in contemplating the single PG 282 hilarity of the attempt. It has accordingly, in some degree, shared the fate of fiction. It is familiarized to us in a kind of serio-ludicrous way, like the story of Guy of Warwick, or Valentine and Orson. The way which we take to perpetuate the memory of this deliverance is well adapted to keep up this fabular notion. Boys go about the streets annually with a beggarly scarecrow dressed up, which is to be burnt, indeed, at night with holy zeal. But meantime they beg a penny for poor Guy. This periodical petition, which we have heard from our infancy, combined with the dress and appearance of the effigy, so well calculated to move compassion, has the effect of quite removing from our fancy the horrid circumstances of the story which is thus commemorated. And in poor Guy vainly should we try to recognize any of the features of that tremendous madman in iniquity, Guido Fawkes, with his horrid crew of accomplices, that sought to emulate earthquakes and bursting volcanoes in their more than mortal mischief. Indeed, the whole ceremony of burning Guy Faux, or the Pope, as he is indifferently called, is a sort of treason travesty, and admirably adapted to lower our feelings upon this memorable subject. The printers of the little 12º prayer book, printed by T. Basket 45 in 1749, which has the effigy of His Sacred Majesty George Roman II, piously prefixed, have illustrated the service, a very fine one in itself, which is appointed for the anniversary of this day, with a print, which it is not very easy to describe, but the contents appear to be these. The scene is a room, I conjecture, in the king's palace. Two persons, one of whom I take to be James himself, from his wearing his hat while the other stands bareheaded, are intently surveying a sort of speculum, or magic mirror, which stands upon a pedestal in the midst of the room, in which a little figure of Guy Faux with his dark lantern approaching the door of the Parliament House is made discernible by the light proceeding from a great eye which shines in from the topmost corner of the apartment, by which eye the pious artist, no doubt, meant to designate Providence. On the other side of the mirror is a figure doing something, which puzzled me PG 283 when a child, and continues to puzzle me now. The best I can make of it is that it is a conspirator busy laying the train. But then, why is he represented in the king's chamber? Conjecture upon so fantastical a design is vain, and I only notice the print as being one of the earliest graphic representations which woke my childhood into wonder, and doubtless combined with the mummery before mentioned, to take off the edge of that horror which the naked historical mention of Guido's conspiracy could not have failed of exciting. Now that so many years are past since that abominable machination was happily frustrated, it will not, I hope, be considered a profane sporting with the subject, if we take no very serious survey of the consequences that would have flowed from this plot if it had had a successful issue. The first thing that strikes us, in a selfish point of view, is the material change which it must have produced in the course of the nobility. All the ancient peerage being extinguished, as it was intended, at one blow, the Red Book must have been closed forever, or a new race of peers must have been created to supply the deficiency. As the first part of this dilemma is a deal too shocking to think of, what a fund of mouth-watering reflections does this give rise to in the breast of us plebeians of A.D. 1823. Why you or I, reader, might have been Duke of, or Earl of, I particularize no titles, to avoid the least suspicion of intention to usurp the dignities of the two noblemen whom I have in my eye. But a feeling more dignified than envy sometimes excites a sigh, when I think how the posterity of Guido's Legion of Honor, among whom you or I might have rolled down dulcified, as Burke expresses it, by an exposure to the influence of heaven in a long flow of generations, from the hard, acidulous, metallic tincture of the spring. 46. What new orders of merit, think you, this English Napoleon would have chosen? Knights of the barrel, or lords of the tub, grand almoners of the cellar, or ministers of explosion? We should have given the train couchant, and the fire rampant in our arms. We should have quartered the dozen white matches in our coats. The shallows would have been nothing to us. Turning away from these mortifying reflections, let us PG 284 contemplate its effects upon the other house, for they were all to have gone together, King, Lords, Commons. To assist our imagination, let us take leave to suppose, and we do it in the harmless wantonness of fancy, to suppose that the tremendous explosion had taken place in our days. We better know what a House of Commons is in our days, and can better estimate our loss. Let us imagine, then, to ourselves, the united members sitting in full conclave above, Faux just ready with his train and matches below, in his hand a reed tipped with fire. He applies the fatal engine. To assist our notions still further, let us suppose some lucky dog of a reporter who had escaped by miracle upon some plank of St. Stephen's benches and came plump upon the roof of the adjacent abbey, from whence descending, at some neighboring coffee house, first wiping his clothes and calling for a glass of lemonade, he sits down and reports what he had heard and seen, quorum pars magna fuit, for the Morning Post or the Courier. We can scarcely imagine him describing the event in any other words but some such as these. A motion was put and carried, that this House do adjourn, that the Speaker do quit the chair. The House rose amid clamors for order. In some such way, the event might most technically have been conveyed to the public. But a poetical mind, not content with this dry method of narration, cannot help pursuing the effects of this tremendous blowing up, this adjournment in the air sine die. It sees the benches mount, the chair first, and then the benches and first the Treasury bench, hurried up in this nitrous explosion, the members, as it were, pairing off, Whigs and Tories taking their friendly apotheosis together, as they did their sandwiches below in Bellamy's room. Fancy, in her flight, keeps pace with the aspiring legislators. She sees the awful seat of order mounting till it becomes finally fixed a constellation, next to Cassiopeia's chair, the wig of him that sat in it taking its place near Berenice's curls. St. Peter, at heaven's wicket, no, not St. Peter, St. Stephen with open arms, receives his own. While fancy beholds these celestial appropriations, reason, no less pleased, discerns the mighty benefit which so complete a renovation must produce below. Let the most determined foe to corruption, the most thorough-paced Ray PG 285 dresser of abuses, try to conceive a more absolute purification of the House than this was calculated to produce. Why, pride's purge was nothing to it. The whole borough-mongering system would have been got rid of, fairly exploded. With it, the senseless distinctions of party must have disappeared, faction must have vanished, corruption have expired in air. From hundred, tithing and wapentake, some new Alfred would have convened, in all its purity, the primitive Wittenagement, fixed upon a basis of property or population, permanent as the poles. From this dream of universal restitution, reason and fancy with difficulty awake to view the real state of things. But, blessed be heaven, St. Stephen's walls are yet standing, all her seats firmly secured. Nay, some have doubted, since the Septennial Act, whether gunpowder itself, or anything short of a committee above stairs, would be able to shake any one member from his seat. That great and final improvement to the Abbey, which is all that seems wanting, the removing Westminster Hall and its appendages, and letting in the view of the Thames, must not be expected in our days. Dismissing, therefore, all such speculations as mere tales of a tub, it is the duty of every honest Englishman to endeavour, by means less wholesale than Guido's, to ameliorate, without extinguishing, parliaments, to hold the lantern to the dark places of corruption, to apply the match to the rotten parts of the system only, and to wrap himself up, not in the muffling mantle of conspiracy, but in the warm, honest cloak of integrity and patriotic intention. Elia.